Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Ellie Krug, the Executive Director of Call for Justice, a small nonprofit based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where we work to connect low-income people with civil legal resources. One of our many projects and initiatives is to collaborate with Greater Twin Cities United Way 211 on how to target legal referrals. And today, as part of a series of training videos that we've conducted, our topic is tribal courts and Native American Indian law. And our speaker today is Ron Walters from the ICWA Law Center. And Ron is a 2010 graduate of the University of St. Thomas School of Law and is currently serving as a staff attorney at the ICWA Law Center. ICWA stands for Indian Child Welfare Act Law Center. Ron represents Native American families in child protection matters, mostly in Hennepin County, that would be Minneapolis Juvenile Court. Prior to joining ICWA, Ron worked for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe for 5 years. At Mille Lacs Band, Ron served as a staff attorney and then lead civil attorney for the band's legal aid office, working in both state and tribal courts. Band member legal aid provides band members with free legal services in the area of family law, child protection, estate planning, consumer law, housing law, public benefits. Ron has an undergraduate degree in English from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he is the married father of a toddler. He enjoys bicycling year-round, I might add, soccer, cross-country skiing, and cooking in his free time, which I'm sure is relatively limited. Please help me welcome Ron Walters.
Thank you very much for the welcome and for hosting. Beautiful building, beautiful setting. Nice to be here today. We had a great discussion yesterday and hopefully an even better one today. So the ICWA Law Center is a nonprofit in Minneapolis that provides legal representation for Indian families in child protection cases. We're primarily practicing in Hennepin County, but we practice in some, we also do St. Paul, some of the outstate counties, and tribal courts too. But most of our cases are in Hennepin County Juvenile Court. I came right from there this morning. It was a full day, so changing gears a little bit, I'm going to talk more broadly about what it's like to work in tribal courts, what it's like to work on behalf of Native American clients, and I think my goal is to give you kind of a top bird's eye view, quick sort of basics introduction to the topic. Like Ellie said, the format here I think is well suited to how I like to do things. Just feel free to ask questions, hop in. I'm more comfortable, I think, responding to questions and having a conversation than I am sort of going through a linear set of notes. So probably the best way to start for people that are unfamiliar with this world is to start by talking a little bit about vocabulary and language. One of the most common questions I get from my relatives and the people that I talk to about what I do is, what is the proper way to identify somebody that's like Native American or American Indian, or can you call somebody an Indian? Are these offensive terms? And I'm certainly not trained as an expert in modern race relations or language or anything like that. I can really only speak from my own experience, but I think it's safe to say that there is no master guidebook that we can look to for the rules and regulations about how to do these kinds of things. People's sense of racial and ethnic identity is very much a personal thing, and people's preferences about what kind of language to use vary, widely from person to person. From very similarly situated people can have different opinions about what kind of language terms there are to use. That being said, in general, the terms Native American, American Indian, and just Indian are all pretty well interchangeable, and you can use them without fear of offending somebody most of the time. I think there are definitely people out there that have opinions and informed opinions about those. But for the layperson, just in general, if you're having a conversation with somebody, I think all three of those terms are safe to use, so you should be able to feel comfortable using them. The other thing that this introductory point kind of segues into, though, is that one of the things I've noticed is that most of my clients, their sense of identity doesn't stop with just being a Native American generally, but that it is really at the tribal level and at the family level. So those are big components too. You know, most people will not just say I'm an American Indian, but people will say I'm from the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, or I'm from Cass Lake, Minnesota, where, you know, a reservation community is. And, you know, people might put a lot of stock in the particular family that they're from. I've spent 5 years working for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. For those of you that are unfamiliar, which I assume most people are not, the Mille Lacs Band is actually a compilation of like 3 or 4 different bands that were put together for political purposes. And the reservation covers area in 3 or 4 counties. And so how one group thinks of themselves in what we call District 1, right on the Mille Lacs Lake, right on kind of 9 o'clock as you're looking at the lake where the casino is. The people in District 1, their values and history is different from those in District 2 and District 3. It's District 3 is out east of Hinckley, almost to the Wisconsin border. So there's quite a range, and each of those areas have their own histories. And I guess what I'm saying is that these things are layered, and they're specific, and they're complicated. So in general, though, I think you can feel safe using the terms that we've talked about. And then I just try to be sensitive in my use of language, listen to what people are saying to me, and then use that kind of language back again. And in doing that, I've avoided any kind of like major foot in my mouth embarrassing moments that I know of. That maybe they've been so embarrassing that I was totally unaware of them. But one of the other questions I get a lot of times is, you know, what is it like to work with Native American people being white yourself? Yes, it's true. I am completely 100% white person, and I had to get comfortable with referring to myself as a white person, which is just a strange experience coming from, you know, living. I grew up in small towns in Wisconsin where everyone was white, and you almost don't even think of yourself in a racial context. But then I would have to describe myself when I was meeting somebody at court for the first time, and I'd have to get comfortable saying I'm the tall white guy with a beard, and it was fine. That's how people thought of me, and I got used to thinking of myself that way too. So, but people ask me what it's like, and I have never experienced that I know of any kind of cross-cultural tension in my relationships with my clients. I've never sensed distrust or any real barriers in terms of building relationships. I really love my relationships with my clients, and I don't think I would be able to do what I've been doing if I didn't feel like I was welcome in the community and able to come to the table and have a conversation and represent people that had a different background than I did. If anything, my experiences are ones that build empathy for the situations that my clients are in. You know, I've definitely experienced situations where there's no explanation for the results that's going on in court other than racial bias, and that's a really difficult thing to confront. One of the, I didn't tell this anecdote yesterday, but one of the cases that it was early on, I was probably only 12 months out of law school at this point, if that. There was a client of mine whose dog had been designated a dangerous dog by the sheriff's department. The dog had gotten loose and had killed like two of the neighbor's chickens. In rural Minnesota, I think this is a relatively common occurrence and doesn't necessarily mean that you have a savage animal that needs to be locked up. But the sheriff's department came to a different conclusion, and it ended up being my first like death row case where I was fighting to save the life of Peabody the dog. And sad to report, I did not succeed, and I have no explanation for what went on other than I think that the sheriff's department had it in for my client for no good reason. So those are the kinds of things I would experience where this is a really sad and seemingly unjust situation that I can't explain except for maybe that there's a biased view of my clients. So other than that, I have not really had a problem reaching across cultures and backgrounds and making relationships. I think that covers kind of the basics about language and about talking about these things. And I think next we'll just kind of talk about the basics of the tribes that are in Minnesota. Most people that I talk to don't even know that we have 11 different tribes in Minnesota. And they are divided into 2 different language groups. That's the main distinction between them. We have Dakota or Sioux tribes on one side of the column, and then Ojibwe or Anishinaabe tribes on the other side. And the 4 Dakota Sioux tribes are the Upper Sioux, Lower Sioux, Prairie Island, and Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux. And then there's 7 Anishinaabe or Ojibwe tribes, and those are Grand Portage, Boys Fort, Red Lake, White Earth, Mille Lacs, and Fond du Lac. And I think those are listed in the handout, I think. So you don't need to remember that off the top of your head. But I work for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, so that's the culture I'm most familiar with. And Ojibwe, that term is still used, and Ojibwe is the name of the language. But at Mille Lacs, it was most common for people to refer to themselves as being Anishinaabe people. Anishinaabe meaning, I think, the people in the Ojibwe language. And so that was the term that was most commonly used. Chippewa is also still out there, too. And, the exact history of how Chippewa became Ojibwe, became Anishinaabe, I'm not an expert on. Chippewa is less common, and I think it has kind of a more anglicized history to it than the other 2 words do. But I think at least 6 of the Ojibwe tribes are under a larger governing body called the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, and that's still the term that they use. MCT still goes by that, so you'll still see Chippewa out there and in use. The basics of what an Indian tribe is that they have to be recognized by the federal government first. That's sort of the first legal issue anyhow. There are certainly groups out there that are not recognized by the federal government and have some kind of historical basis to be considered an Indian tribe, but they have yet to be added to the list that's kept by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs is a department within the Department of the Interior, within the federal government, and they have this list of who's federally recognized and who's not. And I'm not an expert on that process. I can't tell you much about the inner workings, except to say that most of the legal things that are triggered by having an Indian status, it needs to be a federally recognized tribe. And as far as I know, there are still groups that are lobbying to be added to the list that have not been yet. Once you are recognized, you're considered to be a domestic dependent nation. which is this sort of weird hybrid of being sovereign and having the kind of nation-to-nation relationship in the same way United States might relate to France. The United States relates to an Indian tribe. But then there's still this paternalistic element left, and you can see that really clearly in the way that reservations are actually constructed. That a reservation, that land is owned by the federal government and then held what we call in trust for Indian tribes, meaning that the federal government has a fiduciary duty, sort of a legal term for, they have a high ethical standard of dealing they're expected to maintain in order to stay above board, as it were, stay on the right side of the law. And there's definitely been occasions where the federal government has fallen short of that, and there's been litigation, recent litigation, to deal with specific issues that have come up. We've had a couple of things in Minnesota recently. One is the White Earth Land Settlement Act. That is a really interesting historical story that is out there on that. And then also there was a Cobell lawsuit. Cobell is the main name of the plaintiff, and I can't remember the full name of the lawsuit, but they both had to deal with mismanagement of either land resources or income from land that was being held in bank accounts and then mismanaged from there by the federal government. So it's an imperfect relationship, but it's the status today.
So Ron, a couple, just to ask clarification. So several months ago, there was a news story about, very poorly maintained school buildings on Indian reservation land.
Mm-hmm.
Does that go to the government's fiduciary duty to make sure that there are proper schools and other government-related services or buildings on the reservations?
Yeah. I'm not an expert in that, and not intimately familiar with the details, but. Yes, in short, yes. There is sort of a spectrum of independence that Indian tribes have in terms of their ability to run their own schools, and when they have like BIA-run schools. And I think it turns a lot on, the economic resources within a tribe and their ability to build and manage their own schools. At Mille Lacs, where I was before, the tribe had its own high school, elementary school, and actually a really beautiful new sort of state-of-the-art, I think they call it LEED certified, where it's very, environmentally friendly construction. Early childhood education building, that was like a new thing that happened when I was there. And so they had, quite a bit of resources as far as schools go in particular. They also have a clinic and social services agencies and all kinds of stuff going on.
A lot of that would have been derived from casino money?
Yes, in part, yeah. So that's a great segue to talk about Public Law 280. That's the main piece of federal legislation that determines the level of sovereignty that tribes are actually practically able to exercise. So under Public Law 280, it doesn't apply to all states. There's a list of states that are on it. Don't ask me to name them. I'll defer to my law students to research this and no, but it's on the Wikipedia page. But suffice to say that Minnesota is definitely a Public Law 280 state. So that's what controls here. And then, interestingly, it doesn't apply to all tribes. There's one tribe that's accepted from Public Law 280, and that's the Red Lake Nation. And so they have the highest degree of independent sovereignty of the tribes in Minnesota. And what it basically does is it gives joint jurisdiction between the tribe and the county for criminal matters. So if you get pulled over on the reservation, either the tribe or the county can arrest you for whatever infraction you have committed, regardless of whether you're a tribal member or a non-tribal member. There's joint jurisdiction there. But the really interesting thing is that it gives tribes total sovereignty to decide civil regulatory matters. And that is how we got casinos, because gambling is illegal in the rest of the state, but because it's a civil regulatory matter, tribes are able to decide for themselves whether they allow gambling. And having gambling in a state where it's illegal has been great, because it's in effect, a kind of monopoly. So you need to right now go actually onto an Indian reservation if you want to gamble in Minnesota. And so gaming has been sort of the engine of economic development within Indian tribes, but it's not the only thing that's going on. And in Minnesota, the Indian tribes that are here don't have the same kind of natural resources that some of the tribes like in Oklahoma or South Dakota would have, where there's more mineral rights going on. There's maybe oil under the reservation, or some kind of mining that can be done. We don't really have that. It's basically been timber, agriculture, or gaming as the way of making money. But the really interesting thing is we're now in this sort of 2.0 era of tribal economic development, where things are really diversifying, and tribes are taking the revenue that they've made from gaming and trying new business ventures and new projects. Mille Lacs right now is the owner of the majority of the hotel rooms in downtown St. Paul, and that's because they were able to buy a DoubleTree and something else, and now they own like 55% of the hotel rooms in downtown St. Paul or something. So they're trying to make a transition from just casino-based hospitality into other hospitality industries. So they also have bought a hotel in Oklahoma, I think, and they're trying to do more stuff. Yep.
So the right word isn't misnomer, but the way that I've understood it or have heard is that the introduction of gambling into native reservations was a really big deal for a lot of people, and that it had negative consequences. Mm-hmm. So has that been your experience at all, or have you heard that as well? Or there was problems as to who would get money from the actual casinos, a lot of allegations of tribes not getting their amount due. Also, allegations that it wasn't really their idea to come up with casinos as like their primary source of income. Mm-hmm. So anything that you've...
Yeah, I think there was a famous poet that said, "More money, more problems," right? Right. I think we're
somebody.
Yeah, some Tennyson or someone's came up with this. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think if I was to summarize this training in like 3 sentences, it would be Indian tribes can regulate their own affairs. Each tribe does it differently. Everything's complicated. Those are the general rules. Everything else is just fact explorations of different scenarios. But yeah, I can definitely say in my experience that there's big positives and big negatives. One of the really interesting things about working in outstate Minnesota on Indian reservations is that you see that many of the issues that face Indian communities are also being faced by the counties that surround them. And increasingly, what we have in this country, and certainly in Minnesota, is this sort of urban-rural divide, where more and more people are moving to the cities. That's where like the intellectual power is from. We're becoming more of like a service-based economy, and we're doing less farming, less like big manufacturing. It's more like high-tech manufacturing. And so, like where my family goes deer hunting in Wisconsin, for example, when there's like a bad snow year and there's not a lot of snowmobiling happening, there's bars that don't open like the next year because there's been bad weather and been a bad year, and you see kind of how precarious it is in rural Minnesota when you have, you know, hospitality, tourism-based economy, and then something like threatens the tourism. You know, it's pretty fragile. In Mille Lacs, there was a big crisis recently about the amount of walleye that are in Lake Mille Lacs and a big unexplained dip, and the, you know, resort owners that are there that aren't part of the, you know, reservation were, you know, it's a huge crisis for them. So we talk about Indian nations being sovereign, but if somebody gave you a kingdom in the middle of nothing, you know, the question, and you had to, you know, have a nation of people live there, you know, the question would be like, how do you create jobs for people in a barren, you know, natural resource-free rural environment? And if you look at like the Pine Ridge Reservation, there's nothing going on there to, you know, to really generate. I shouldn't say nothing. I can't say I'm intimately familiar, but, you know, it's routinely pointed to as like one of the poorest and where life is, you know, pretty uniformly very, very difficult, and not much resources. There's a huge diversity in the wealth even among the tribes that we have in Minnesota. If you look at the Bois Forte tribe, which is way up near Virginia, I think they have a casino. It's tiny, and you have to drive, if you live in Minneapolis, past like 4 or 5 other casinos to get to it. So it doesn't do a whole lot in terms of generating revenue. You compare that to the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, that have, I forgot the name again, forgot it yesterday, Mystic Lake. They're a small tribe. I think they're like around 500 people, and they have the largest and most successful casino because of their proximity to the Twin Cities. So basically the way it is worked is that casinos have been the main economic engine. It's more complicated than that, but they've been the main engine. Tribes have used that money to pay for resources shared by the whole tribe first, like schools, clinics, social services, to build up like their government infrastructure first. And then if there's any money left over, then that money can be divided between the tribal members. How that's done, though, varies from tribe to tribe. So I think one of the things you're referring to is there's been, I don't know if scandal's the right word, but certainly controversies with certain groups of people in power within a reservation deciding that people that were formerly enrolled can no longer be enrolled, and those kinds of things. And so,
talk about enrollment.
Yep, and yeah, we'll talk about enrollment. In fact, now's a good time because I probably wouldn't be capable of just remembering and coming back to it. So enrollment is the most commonly used term to describe somebody that's actually a legal citizen of an Indian tribe. They're enrolled with the tribe, and that means that the tribe has conferred upon that person the benefits of membership. That decision is totally up to how the tribe wants to do it. There's no, you know, uniform process or procedure. The tribe gets to decide itself how it's going to identify its own members. You know, probably the 2 most common systems that you'll see will be what we call a blood quantum system, where you have to establish that a certain percentage of your lineage is comes from currently recognized band members. Like at Mille Lacs, for example, I think it's 25%. You have to establish that 25% of your blood quantum is from either Mille Lacs or from other MCT tribes. And then others have like a Descendancy Model, where it's more about proving that you just have a direct connection rather than ending up with a specific percentage. So I think the Cherokee in Oklahoma are like that, and so you have a lot of people enrolled in the Cherokee Nation that you probably wouldn't recognize as being Indian, you know, just based on appearance.
I'm sorry, can I just add, so, because it's always been really, really interesting to me that natives are the only ethnic group, which, I mean, again, like, just going back to your kingdom analogy, it's, I mean, it's kind of the reverse, right? Like, they had the kingdom, and then it was stolen, and then they were allowed to kind of keep, like, the backyard, right?
Right.
But it's interesting that they, you know, that there's all this blood quantum system, like you just described, and so I'm assuming that that's not something that they came up with themselves, or is it? I mean, was it something going back to, like, the Bureau of Indian Affairs? Was that?
That's a good question, and that's a historical fact that I don't know.
Okay.
So yeah, for my purposes, all I can tell you is that the tribes get to determine now for themselves whether it's a historically, you know, consistent way with how they've identified themselves previously, or it's something that they've adopted according to a government system imposed on them. You know, I don't know. The point is now they can decide for themselves.
And so then for your work specifically, this is probably what you were heading into, like, if I were to be officially enrolled, do I get like a card? Do I get a passport? Do I, and then if so, is that something that I would have to show to you to be eligible for your services?
It's going to vary from tribe to tribe how they, you know, what comes in the membership kit or whatever, you know, like if there's a passport or an ID that looks like a driver's license, or your name just appears in a book somewhere, or, you know, they can do whatever they want to do. And so there's no uniform system for that. For our purposes, the county, when it's doing a child protection investigation, has a burden imposed on them by the law to try to make efforts to determine whether somebody has ancestry that would trigger the Indian Child Welfare Act. In order for the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is a federal piece of legislation, to apply, a child that's subject to a child protection proceeding has to be either enrolled currently or eligible for enrollment and have one parent enrolled. So the Social Services Department has to ask questions to that effect when they're doing their whole intake process. And then right when our jobs begin, when a child is actually removed from the home, sometimes a child is left in the home, but the court process is still started because they want court supervision and intervention in the situation. But most of the time it's because a child is actually placed into foster care, and that's when the court process starts. And we pick up cases. Our office actually contracts with Hennepin County to be public defenders. So we work right alongside actual, I think public defenders are state employees. There's a state public defender office. And then for the non-ICWA cases, they go with regular PDs, and then for ICWA cases, our office picks them up. And then we actually stay with our cases and keep them even if they're determined not to be an ICWA case ultimately. If it turns out the child has heritage of some kind but isn't eligible for membership ultimately, we still just stay on the case, just because you develop a lot of the relationship and a lot of trust in the first few hearings, and then if it comes out later on, we don't want to sort of force them to change boats midstream and start working with somebody else. So, good question though. Did I answer all of it?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have another one.
But, okay.
Okay, so do the cases go through the established courts, or, because I guess I had this vision of, like, you know, them going through tribal courts and it being a lot different. So I guess that would be the question.
Yeah, that's good. You're doing my segues for me. I like it. Part of the benefit of sovereignty is being able to structure your own government and create your own government. All the tribes in Minnesota, as far as I am aware, there is no exception, all have their own tribal court. The jurisdiction of tribal courts over members of other tribes people that aren't enrolled in a tribe at all is a pretty complicated area of the law that I don't want to like bore you with right now. But the courts are there and they have jurisdiction over different kinds of cases. And in the child protection setting, one of the big advantages that's created by the Indian Child Welfare Act is that parents have the ability to decide whether they want their case heard in state court or they would rather hear it heard by their tribe. And when the case transfers from a county jurisdiction to tribal court, it starts over entirely. The tribe is totally sovereign in its decision. It doesn't have to defer to what has happened previously. It can make totally different decisions. And yeah, go ahead.
So my question is about the ever difficult situation of the Native American parent and the non-Native American parent, one wanting tribal court, one wants state court. Tribal court, my understanding, with the enrolled child, they would have a preference, right?
Who would have a preference?
So if the Native American parent wanted to be heard in tribal court and the other parent didn't because the child is enrolled, it would be tribal court, right?
No. If it starts in the county, parents have absolute veto power over a transfer to tribal court. And they don't need to provide an explanation, they don't need to make a formal legal argument. All they have to say is, I don't want this case heard in tribal court, and it doesn't go.
Ron, what kind of case are you talking about?
In child protection.
Child protection.
Yep.
I think Jennifer was a little bit, were you talking?
I was talking about child protection.
Okay.
I was talking specifically about a case when one parent wanted tribal court and the other did not.
Well, so we should distinguish too. Child protection is different from child custody, right? So in a child protection case, you have a government authority intervening in a parent-child relationship, taking temporary custody of a child, and then imposing certain things that need to be done before custody can be returned. That's one set of circumstances. The other is a child custody case. We would often call them like a private custody case because the parties are just the parents. So that's like your typical dad wants every other weekend parenting or whatever, the 50-50 split, and then they go into court to figure out some governing of their relationships. As it comes to child protection, if a case starts in county court under the Indian Child Welfare Act, the parents have the ability to motion the court to transfer to tribal court, but if they disagree, the parent that doesn't want it to go wins, basically.
Okay, I thought it was the other way around. Thank you for clarifying.
Yep. And then talking about private custody cases, those may be able to be transferred into tribal court, but not in the same way. The Indian Child Welfare Act, creates like a chutes and ladders kind of structure where a case can just go right out the door and there's a procedure for that whole thing to happen. Concerning the private child custody thing, and I imagine that child protection and child custody things are probably the things that an organization like 211 would get the most calls about, because I think those are the most common issues that people have. Certainly when at Mille Lacs we did basically all civil legal aid type services, and child protection and family law was probably 60% of what we did, just because those are the biggest. People have kids and people have problems and people have problems with their kids. So that's that's what happens. And
that's why we need lawyers, Ron.
Right. And so another piece of federal legislation that's important in this context is called the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction Enforcement Act. And basically what that does is it makes tribal courts and state courts respect each other's orders. When you're outside of the child custody jurisdiction, when does a state court need to recognize a tribal court order and when does a tribal court order need to recognize a state court order is a nuancey, complicated question depending on what kind of case you're talking about. And the UCCJEA makes it simple and basically says tribes have to accept county decisions for custody and vice versa. And so the nice thing is if you lose a case in one jurisdiction, you can't just go start another case in another jurisdiction. I mean, I guess it's depending on who you are, it's nice. For consistency's sake, it's nice that, you know, whoever starts, once a child custody order has been entered, that jurisdiction is considered to have continuing exclusive jurisdiction, meaning that unless the parties agree or there's some other special case, it's going to stay there and be heard there, and you can't go somewhere else.
So if we get a call from a parent saying something like, this happened in tribal court or this happened in county court and I don't like it, what can I do? Then one of the questions was like, did you go through the whole process? Has there been a custody order? That would be something we could ask.
Yeah.
Right, but what we don't want to do is we don't want to be giving, you know, advice. As always, my standard instruction. And when that caller does call you with that, what you need to do is just say, this is a particularly complicated area of the law, and you need to talk to a lawyer about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and Dave, did you had a question?
Yeah, I was going to follow up on Jennifer's question and ask, are there a lot of issues between tribal court to tribal court of which one has jurisdiction? You know, one tribe, one person, one family member wants this tribal court, another one wants the other tribal court. Do conflicts and issues come up with that? Certainly. You know, choice of venue is one of the things we talk about in civil procedure and law school as being a major strategic decision in a case. You know, is like what's the venue that's friendliest to my situation? And I think any time that there's multiple venues open to people, they're going to have a preference and they're going to try to take steps to get the case heard where they want it heard. Is there a clear rule that I could, you know, cite to you for if Boys Fort wants, you know, if somebody wants it to go to Boys Fort and somebody else wants it to go to Mille Lacs? I couldn't give you a short answer because it's going to depend on the kind of case. You know, there's due process questions, how the exact extent of a tribe's jurisdiction over non-band members, or members of a different tribe. Those are complicated issues, and I'd have to hear like a pretty specific scenario in order to like give you a for instance of what might come out the other side. Okay, that's fair.
Yeah. One of those questions that can just be answered by, it's complicated. It depends on the situation.
So just going back to state court versus tribal court, so my understanding just of child protection in general is somebody has a concern that a child is being mistreated, right? Mm-hmm. So they would call a child protective agency, and then they, you know, if they wanted to follow up, they would, and then from there it would go to court, right? Pretty much. So is there a tribal version of child protective services?
Yep, yeah, great question. Yeah. So like we were kind of talking about before, you know, tribes have built up their own government infrastructure. Most of my experience is limited, so I can't say I have firsthand knowledge that here's exactly what all tribes have. We actually talked yesterday about a potential project. It was sort of like mapping all of the, you know, different departments and resources that are there across tribes. But with Mille Lacs, for example, just because that's what I'm most familiar with, the tribe definitely has a family services. It's called the Family Services is the name of their social services department. And they have their own child protection workers, their own investigative workers, and their own ongoing case management workers. Under the Indian Child Welfare Act, Indian tribes have exclusive child protection jurisdiction over children that reside on the reservation itself. So if you call Mille Lacs County, for example, to report a situation that involves a child living on the reservation, the Mille Lacs County social worker cannot just come and start investigating that situation without the assistance of the tribal social services agency. The
in general, the relationship between the Mille Lacs Band and Mille Lacs County is pretty fraught and has got various issues, but I actually saw pretty good cooperation between the tribal social workers and the county workers. This is a good place to start talking about a little bit of the history and context behind the Indian Child Welfare Act. There's probably few areas that are as sensitive and as fraught with tension as child welfare between mainstream culture and Native communities. And the basic history of relations between the federal government and tribes is basically in 3 chapters. The first one is termination, which sounds like what it is, you know, where the way to deal with the problem was to try to make it go away entirely. Terrible, very dark period in our history. And then sort of the next phase was the assimilation phase, which was sort of, okay, well, trying to kill everybody didn't work. Like we should just try to make all these people like us and get them integrated into our culture, and that will solve the problem. One of the ways they did that was through a piece of legislation called the Dawes Act, where it broke reservations down. Instead of being land held in trust for the entire community, say, okay, well, you're over the age of 18 and a male, well, you get 80 acres of tribal land held in trust and put in your name, and we're going to try and turn you into a farmer, was, you know, like the idea there. And then the legacy of that thing is still going on, because that now what you have is all of these individuals that received individual interest in trust land, many of whom die without a will. When you die without a will, in general, your property is automatically divided in equal shares among your children. So all of a sudden, you have multiple generations with multiple children. Somebody that at one point owned an 80-acre piece of land, their great-grandchild now owns 4 760ths of an 80-acre parcel on the White Earth Reservation. And so there's efforts underway to try to sort of reconsolidate some of those things and some of those tracts, and trying to sort of correct some of the stuff that was done there. The other really difficult part about the assimilation period was what was done to children. There was literally county social workers driving onto reservations, rounding up kids, and then taking them and placing them into white foster homes to be adopted, because they had just determined that there was no way they were going to lead a successful or meaningful life on the reservation, and that they'd be far better living with like a rich white family. So not only was that done with individual families, but there was entire boarding schools that were created where children's hair were cut, they were beaten for speaking their languages, and you know, there's these really crazy pictures you can see if you Google like Indian boarding schools. They show like the sort of before and after of some of these kids, and the way they looked, you know, going into the school and the way they look coming out. And it is a totally devastating experience. Yeah, it was a really bad period. And you still have grandparents on the reservation that went to boarding schools and have that in their mind. You still have grandparents on the reservation that remember social workers coming onto the reservation and being told by their parents to go hide in the woods because they were coming and like rounding kids up. So the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978, which is really not that long ago, and it was passed in response to grossly disproportionate representation of Native American children in foster care. Unfortunately, the disproportionate representation goes on today, and in fact, statistically, there has not been a lot of improvement. Even in Minnesota, one of the states I think is the most kind of progressive in general on Native American issues, things are still very dismal when you look at the amount of Native American children in the foster care system. In Hennepin County, I mean, I can't quote you exact statistics, but I would bet 25% of the resources between judges, county attorneys, workers that are focused on ICWA cases versus non-ICWA cases. You know, considering the relatively low percentage of the population that Native Americans are in this state, it's still ridiculously high. So these problems are still going on. The Indian Child Welfare Act tries to correct these issues by giving tribes, like I said, exclusive jurisdiction over their own kids. The kids living on the reservation, they get to decide entirely what happens with those children. When a case opens in the county, the case can be transferred back to the tribe, and when it stays there, it makes the tribe an actual party to the case. So in a non-ICWA case, you'll basically just have the parents, the social worker, and the county attorney, and a guardian ad litem. If you guys know what that is, a guardian ad litem is somebody appointed by a judge to advocate for just the interests of the child. And those will basically be the players in a non-ICWA case. And then in an ICWA case, you'll have the tribe actually have a representative, and sometimes a representative and an attorney there at the table, and they get to weigh in on what the court does, just like any other party does. There's also different, one of the really great things, and I was just having a conversation with one of the ICWA social workers, and she was telling me that this practice has actually become the norm best practice now. But in an ICWA case, the county is required to provide active efforts to reunify a family rather than just what's called reasonable efforts. So the idea is that if you're a non-ICWA case, when you have your child placed in foster care, you get a list of stuff that you need to do to get the kid back. Generally, it begins with drug and alcohol treatment, because almost all child protection cases have that at issue in some level. So you get this list of stuff to do, and then it's kind of on you to do it, regardless of what other issues you might have going on in your life. Active efforts recognizes that without practical support in place to help people accomplish those things, they might not be able to do it. So there's higher expectation for providing phone assistance, transportation assistance, and some of the practical things that people need to really meet their case plan objectives. And so what the social worker was telling me is that active efforts way of dealing with things is really what is becoming the norm, best practices model for doing social work in child protection situations. So it makes sense to me in my practical experience. You know, things like drug addiction and domestic violence, they generally exist within a whole cluster of problems that people are dealing with. And, you know, to try and just isolate one issue without addressing the others is really difficult. And so it's a more holistic and comprehensive way of trying to reunify a family. The whole goal of the child protection system is to get that child back in the home, if at all possible. And so the idea is that the state, in exercising, you know, it's, I think the Latin term is like parens patriae, or whatever they call it, that sort of, you know, we need to look out for kids when parents fail thing. In doing that, if they're going to remove a child and place it in foster care, then they have an obligation to try and get that kid back home if possible and try to address the issues that were there. So that's another big part of the Indian Child Welfare Act is active efforts versus reasonable efforts. How are we doing on time? Just
You've got about another 15 minutes.
Okay, cool. So I think we talked a good amount about child protection and family law. We talked a little bit about probate, which is an issue that we would get asked about a lot. And a lot of those questions had to do with what I was saying about the Dawes Act, about what do I do if my grandfather had this right to a certain portion of tribal land and he's passed away, what happens? The Bureau of Indian Affairs handles probates for trust land. And as far as a general resource goes for questions, they're a good place to point people to. The closest office that I'm aware of is in Duluth. I think that there's something here in Bloomington, but that's the Office of Hearing and Appeals, which is like another part of the Department of the Interior that actually does the probate proceedings. But I don't think they have sort of a general, like, call us and ask us your questions kind of office. The Duluth one does. They have a phone number that is easy to grab off of the internet, and they have like live bodies that answer the phone there. So it's a good place to, depending on how extensive the services you're providing are, either to point people to or to call. In working in legal aid in civil legal services, a lot of the job is trying to triage and try to slot problems into categories that you recognize. And there's a lot of novel situations that are things you haven't encountered before and maybe cross multiple areas. And I found that in my job, Google was a huge tool, and then the other thing was actually picking up the phone and trying to talk to people and actually put questions to people. And so there's not a ton of sort of clearinghouse resources in general on civil legal questions involving Native American issues. So there's really only a couple of phone numbers and contact information I can leave you guys with, because there's just not a ton out there in a sort of a central, easy to access kind of way.
And can I interrupt you on that?
Yeah.
So, oftentimes we're training and we're referring to pseudo clearinghouses like lawhelp.mn.org or Legal Aid Online, where there may be the ability to ask one question or to pose or do some basic research with a static website and come up with maybe here is the hub to get this question answered. What Ron is telling us is with Indian law, tribal court questions, this is far more problematic. And we don't have the one place where we can go to generally. Now we have Anishinaabe Legal Services up in northwest Minnesota, but the problem is that's legal aid, that's eligibility based, and it's Anishinaabe, for the most part, Anishinaabe tribe members that it only serves. So this is problematic, and I think that it's important with your callers that, and I know you're doing this, but just to reinforce that, you're letting them know that they have to be persistent in what they're doing, and they have to think imaginatively when they run into roadblocks. For example, reaching out to the BIA on something that might be a law-related matter, but may have some other implications toward it. And there are a number of other resources, but we have tried on our training paper to list, as far as we can tell, the resources in Minnesota as it relates to Indian law.
Yep. So. Great. Yeah, in fact, one of the questions yesterday, I think this is a good example of how particular a question can be and sort of how difficult it could be to find a quick answer for it. If I understood the question that was being put to what's the position for the people on the phone? What's it?
INR.
Yeah, an INR person.
Don't call them operators.
Okay. I think the question was, I'm 55 and there is a benefit that I get from my tribe at 55, but only if I'm living on the reservation. And I want to live off the reservation and still get this benefit, I think is sort of roughly what the question was like. So, as far as I know, there is no Indian law governing retirement benefits. You know, retirement benefits are a function of either private employment with a company and your 401k or pension or whatever you have available to you, or Social Security, you know, and that federal government program. I'm not aware of any sort of special retirement program that exists for Native American tribes. I am aware that some tribes, when they have per capitas, Mille Lacs is one, that once you become an elder, and I think their age was 55 to become an elder, you got an elder supplement. So in addition to your monthly per capita, you got another bump for reaching the age 55.
Ron, you need to explain per capita.
Yeah, okay, we can. And I think I touched on this a little bit, saying like if there's enough economic development that there's money left over after the infrastructure is paid for, it's often divided up just on a per person basis or per capita basis. And not all tribes in Minnesota have a per capita. Mille Lacs is one for sure, but the payment there is only $933 a month. It's nice if you're employed full-time. It's a bonus on top of that. It's not a lot of money to try and live on if that's your only means of getting by. The caller was asking about whether some application of his tribe's rules on this elder supplement, assuming that's what he was talking about, to him. If that question was put to me, I would be going, I guess, to his tribe's website, and looking there and seeing if there was somebody in their Office of Management and Budget, or whoever sort of like handled that kind of program, to see if there was somebody I could talk to get a better answer to his question. But the point is that that's a tribal policy of that particular tribe, and it's really hard to receive a question about that particular policy and point somebody to a resource, because a lawyer that's going to work on the issue has to be licensed in that tribal court, most likely, or it's got to be somebody else with specific knowledge about the rules and application and how you appeal and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's a good example of a question that would be hard to field, and if you get a lot of those, then my best thoughts are with you. What were some of the other questions because that was one yesterday. I think there was a question about that we kind of talked about. It was sort of a general question about how do you qualify for membership? How do you become a member?
You talked a little bit about birth certificate can be issues, and we had some callers with birth certificate questions.
Yeah.
So maybe you might want to touch on that in the 5 minutes you've got left.
So at Mille Lacs, they're a blood quantum tribe, and the evidence that they use to determine blood quantum is birth certificates. If it's not on a birth certificate, it doesn't count. So if your mother was a single woman when you were born, and no one signed your birth certificate as the father, then that whole lineage is not being included in your blood quantum analysis. Or if the wrong father was listed, which happens more than I would have thought. That a woman was not with the father of her child at the time the child was born, and so the father, the new boyfriend, basically signs the birth certificate as a sort of a gesture of, I'm going to help you with this child and stuff, and that can create confusion about who's legitimately on the birth certificate or not. So we fielded lots of questions about correcting mistakes on birth certificates, because people would come to discover that, well, they had enough blood quantum themselves to qualify as members. Their children, without a father that also had blood quantum on their side, didn't qualify. So they'd be trying to, get the paternity issue straightened out so that the children could get enrolled. So, a lot of that was operating all under state law. We could address some paternity issues in tribal court also, but we'd be basically using state statutes in tribal court on paternity stuff, and then trying to blend that state law stuff with how you get somebody on or off your birth certificate with the tribal policies over like what kind of blood quantum you need. And so that, we'd be trying to work with both of those systems to solve people's issues.
You also talked yesterday about elder law and elder abuse, some in relation to the payments, but also generally about some issues, because where again do our 2-on-1 folks refer callers where they suspect elder abuse is at issue?
Yeah. So as far as I know, every county in Minnesota has a vulnerable adult protection division of some kind. I think they all have child protection, and they all have like vulnerable adult divisions. If somebody were to ask me, what do I do about a elder abuse issue for an Indian person, because elder abuse verges on criminal, depending on what's going on and because criminal jurisdiction is shared across tribes and counties, I would in general encourage somebody to report it to the county. If you don't know anything specifically about the tribe, a county social services agency is I think just as good of a place to start as any.
For elder abuse, the state has transitioned into 1-800 number central intake for all counties.
Oh.
Would you advise us to use central intake or to try to find the back door because it's such a specialized question?
I would, I guess, probably go with the 1-800 number. If that's the system that they've set up, that's news to me. I didn't know that. So
it's within the last year or so.
Yeah. Okay.
What I would tell you to do is give them the 800 number, but also tell the caller that if nothing happens within a reasonable period of time, say a week, if there hasn't been somebody assigned to the matter, they haven't gotten a follow-up call back from a state or a county agency, that they call you back and that they report to, because it's not necessarily that they'll get the same INR person, but they report, they got the number, a week ago, 10 days ago, nothing has happened, then my advice would be help them find the back door.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah. So, because we have to be persistent for our callers too, sometimes.
Yeah, the back door is usually not that hard to find, so
Right.
we can figure it out.
Right. I mean, optimally you're giving them both numbers and saying if the first one doesn't work, try the second one. But at a minimum, tell them that if this doesn't work, call us back and we'll see what we can do about helping you in a different way.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the difficult things with those issues is that there's
very dramatic.
Not always clear answers for the reporters about what happened, because you get in like data privacy kind of things. Certainly with child protection, that's the case. If you call and report a child protection issue, the county may actually be prohibited from telling anybody what's going on with it until it gets to court and gets out into the public system. If it's just still within the agency being investigated, then they may not even be able to disclose what happened. So we dealt with that a lot. People, calling and be like, I reported this and they're not telling me what's going on, and I want to know what's going on because that's my nephew, and his mom is doing this and doing that, and child protection needs to get over there. And then at that point, we'd be kind of like, well, geez, I can call the Solicitor General's office. That's like the tribal prosecutor, basically, and call them and see what they can tell me about it, and if they can tell me anything about it, I can share that information with you. But a lot of times we would say it's sort of with the agency until they bring it to court, and we don't really have any power to like speed up their investigation or get any more information about what's going on. Then you just kind of have to report and cross your fingers,
Well, one thing I advise callers to do, and I have a stack of these in my desk, is for child protection and adult protection. No, they won't give you any details, but they will send you a fancy letter that says whether they're investigating or not, so you can at least make sure it got to the right person.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Again, it's about persistence.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things that I just want to stress based on part of what you've talked about is the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We don't have them on the outlines that you have right now, but we're going to add it to the outline that will be on the website when we post this training. Remember that number, okay? And we'll get it to you via email as well, but you've got it in your database somewhere, I'm sure. But write it on your outlines, because the BIA is a place to be sending people to for a lot of different things. So, that should be included as part of, your referrals on many things. You're going to give them a primary, but the BIA, I think, would fall into the category of fallback or secondary referral. Ron, we're just about out of time. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything else that you would like to add?
Any questions? Any general questions that we didn't get a chance to ask? I don't think so. You could do a whole semester, frankly, studying like the Indian Child Welfare Act. You could spend an entire semester doing, economic development in tribal nations, and each one of these things can be blown up in detail. But I just hope you sort of having a bird's eye view of basically what the situation is. That we have these 11 tribes. They have this civil sovereignty that allows them to determine their own policies and laws. We didn't talk much about actual tribal law that goes with the idea of having a court. You can pass your own laws, and that's one of the big things that contributes to sort of my routine, like it depends on the tribe and depends on the situation answer, because not only are they sovereign in terms of how they interact with the state government or whatever, but they can really pass their own legislation and set their own policies. And in that way, it's really interesting to see the way that tribes are operating as sort of experiments in democracy. They have unique problems and have unique resources to deal with it that is different than from the way that the county might be. And the tribes are in flux. They're changing in regards to the problems that are surrounding them and that they're facing. And I think outsiders tend to think about like Native culture as being historically based. Like everything that happened with Native culture happened before Columbus got here, and it's been changing. It was changing all before Columbus got here in response to the changes that were going on around them, and it's continued to change. And so it's a very vibrant and interesting world that I feel like I've been really privileged just to kind of touch and interact with in the limited amount that I have. So you can certainly add my name to.
We'll do that off camera.
Okay. Yeah.
Otherwise, you'll get a million emails.
Yeah, I'm sure. But yeah, you can consider me a resource personally for questions that come up, because, like we were saying, there's not a great central place, and a lot of my experience came from being in a legal aid office that was funded by a tribe and our clients were members of that one particular tribe. And so we did a lot and helped people with a lot of the same kinds of issues that I'm guessing people are calling you about. but a little bit unfortunate in that we weren't, open to the public for, we really could only serve Mille Lacs Band members. So, our office had a lot of experience that if there's any way we can share with other people, happy to do that. So,
well, help me in thanking Ron Walters for a great presentation.
Thank you.
This concludes another Call for Justice training video with United Way 211. Call for Justice is a small nonprofit in Minneapolis. We are entirely based on grants and donations. If you have found this training or other trainings to be valuable for you, please consider donating to Call for Justice. It's very easy. It's right on our website. All you have to do is hit a button, and you can donate through your PayPal account or your credit card. We thank you very much. We appreciate your attention, and we look forward to providing another video at a future date on another legal topic. Thank you.